Okay, good morning, everybody. This is the 3rd of February, 2024. Of course, the year is almost over. I'm actually going to start this presentation utilizing voice notes, but I'll explain that to you in a minute. The time, of course, now is 9:22. This is voice note number 1. There'll be a series of voice notes on the topic, the ultimate disaster, that is war. And what I intend doing for the benefit of the communities and the benefit of the group is this voice note, firstly, will just explain how I will do the presentation. Those of you that attended my presentation on earthquakes in South Africa will understand that I will try and keep the voice notes to less than 5 minutes of voice note. I'm also doing a Zoom recording for this. So at some point further down the line, I will be using this for additional training for the disaster relief CERT volunteers in particular. But that being said, what I'd like everybody on this group to understand is that first and foremost, I will be presenting a series of voice notes purely on WhatsApp, purely for the sake and benefit of allowing everybody on the group to, in actual fact, be able to listen to the presentation at their own convenience without being expected to attend a particular webinar or Zoom meeting or even a sit-down meeting in our Emergency Operations Center. This way, any new members that come in after the presentation has started, I, of course, will send them the voice notes up until that time that they join separately so that they don't go out on the group on a regular basis. It is unfortunate that most people use WhatsApp and not Telegram, because at least on Telegram, new members to the group would have been able to scroll up and go and get all of the messages and follow the entire conversation. Maybe on the next one, we'll see how things develop over the course of the year. I might look at introducing all of this on the Telegram platform, not on the WhatsApp platform, and see how that in actual fact rolls out and benefits the communities as a whole. So this first voice note is to explain to all the group members that the presentation and discussion will be held via voice note. The second one that I'm going to do now will be an introduction of who I am in my personal capacity and who Disaster Relief CERT is. That will then give you the basis and the groundwork as to where we are coming from and why it is that, based on the question that was raised, why I decided to introduce this specific topic for the benefit of the communities and all the residents throughout the Republic of South Africa. Take note, I did say the Republic of South Africa, we are a national organization, and this is open to everybody countrywide. Seeing as it is only 9:30 now, and I did say we would probably kick off around about 11 o'clock, bearing in mind that I've got load shedding from 1200, I will do the voice note, send it out now around about 9:30. And I'd like to encourage everybody to share the link with more people. Let's get as many people as possible up on the group before around about 11 o'clock. Between now and then, I'm going to start doing the presentation. At some point throughout the presentation of the voice notes, I will in actual fact type up a question or anything, or open the group up, anything of interest. I might open the group up at some point and invite comments or questions in order for us to get an idea of what the next voice note or two should in actual fact cover as far as topic is concerned. So that being said, I'm coming up for 4.5 minutes. Thank you very much for joining the group and for attending. And I hope that you find the presentation informative. I know some people might actually realize that, well, that's not exactly something that they should consider. However, I would like to encourage you to rather listen because you never know what's going to happen tomorrow. That there is one of the biggest questions. So for the Zoom presentation, just be aware of the fact that there are going to be a couple of gaps in between everything here. And I'll try and keep it going as smoothly as possible. Thanks all. This is Chad Milam, Echo One out. Okay, this is now voice note number 2 on the 3rd of February 2024, time is 09:29. I'm going to continue with the discussion and the presentation on the subject of the ultimate disaster, war. In the first voice note, I actually just explained to everybody how I would do the presentation, and I said in voice note number 2, I will do an introduction of who we are as an organization and of myself personally. So that being said, let's get started. My name is Chad Milam. I am one of the 3 founding members of a non-government organization registered as a non-profit company and public benefit organization. I am also one of the 3 directors of the company itself. And the company's name is Disaster Relief CERT. CERT being an acronym for Community Emergency Response Teams, where our total and absolute upfront principal object and purpose is in actual fact to create awareness amongst communities on a disaster, and of course part and parcel of that ancillary objectives are to recruit volunteers, train volunteers, and in terms of creating awareness amongst communities, we need to be able to engage with community members, with residents of all the communities throughout the country, and ultimately at the end of the day be able to share information and insight into the potential risk of disasters, and more specifically to recruit volunteers within each of the local communities, so that our communities will be able to reach out and assist not only our family members, but also our community members in times of a disaster. As far as our qualifications, etc., are concerned, I'm going to start with Stephen Reynolds, which is the first name that came to my mind. Stephen is an IT specialist and also a licensed amateur radio operator. Stephen was also responsible for managing and coordinating RAE, or radio amateur examination classes, for several years within our area of the western side of Johannesburg. Then we have John Groom, a fellow incorporator and board director. John Groom goes back 40 years with me in South African Red Cross Society. John used to head up as the coordinator of manpower and training. He in actual fact was involved in that, and then brought me in from the volunteer side in order to assist him, and that's how we got going on the full-time basis with South African Red Cross. We both left, and I went back a second time. I went back as the operations manager for SA Red Cross, at which point I received extensive training provided by the International Committee of the Red Cross as far as disaster relief and management was concerned. Both John and I also attained Emergency Medical Assistant 1 qualifications, which of course in terms of new legislation has in actual fact expired. However, that is knowledge and understanding that nobody can take away from us. It is on this basis that we formed, myself, as I said, operations manager. Both John and I are also IT specialists as well. I've just completed a 23-year project, business project as far as IT is concerned. However, all 3 of us are licensed radio amateurs, and I'm also the director of MCOM Pty Limited, the supplier of two-way radio communications specifically intended for communities to be able to communicate with each other in times of disaster, and especially, you know, when cell phone networks and internet connectivity fails in the general sense of the word. Okay, I think that there's a very brief introduction. I will post the website for Disaster Relief CERT. Please go and read up more about us, and I'm on the 5-minute limit. We'll move on to voice note number 3 shortly. Okay, 3rd of Feb 2024, 10:16. We're moving on to part 3 or voice note number 3 of the disaster relief cert discussion on the ultimate disaster being war. We've only covered the method within which this presentation would be held and a brief introduction to disaster relief cert and myself in particular. But in part 3, I actually want to quickly cover a summary of the Geneva Conventions of 12 August 1949 and their additional protocols. And I think it must be understood that whenever you speak about war, war comes hand in hand with international humanitarian law. And all international humanitarian law is actually based on the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols, the 4 Geneva Conventions, which we will probably cover in over 2 voice notes to give you an idea of how this actually applies to our societies as a whole. However, my apologies. In order to understand what international humanitarian law, otherwise is known short acronym as IHL, this is a set of rules that seek for humanitarian reasons to limit the effect of armed conflict. That's the whole purpose of international humanitarian law. It seeks to limit the effects of armed conflict. Now, the way that this is done is IHL ultimately protects persons who are not or who are no longer participating in hostilities. Take particular note of that. It says who are no longer or not involved in hostilities. And that plays a very important role in understanding IHL, because soldiers who are injured are probably not going to continue fighting. Therefore, they shouldn't be killed. Or because of the fact that they are injured, they've been removed from the battlefield, and therefore they should also not be killed because they're no longer participating in the hostilities. And this restricts the means and methods of warfare. IHL is also known as the law of war and the law of armed conflict. And a major part of IHL is contained in the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949 that have been adopted by virtually all of the nations of the world. The conventions have been expanded and supplemented by 2 further agreements, the additional protocols of 1977 relating to the protection of victims of armed conflicts, and in 2005, the 3rd additional protocol was introduced relating to the adoption of an additional distinctive emblem. Now, these conventions provide specific rules to safeguard both combatants on the one hand, members of the armed forces who are wounded, sick, or shipwrecked, prisoners of war, and civilians, as well as the medical personnel, the military chaplains, and civilian support workers of the military. And this is something that is vitally important that must be understood as to who exactly is being protected by the Geneva Conventions as a whole, as well as the additional protocols. So in closing on this very brief section of international humanitarian law, I just want to read that again, and I'm quoting ultimately from the summary of the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the additional protocols. These conventions provide specific rules to safeguard combatants or members of the armed forces who are wounded, that's Geneva Convention 1, sick or shipwrecked, Convention 2, prisoners of war, and civilians, which is all covered in 3 and 4, as well as the medical personnel, military chaplains, and the civilian support workers of the military. Take note, the civilian support workers of the military are also protected. Now, in the next voice note, I just want to quickly cover the different emblems, because I am over the 5-minute mark. So I'm going to move over to voice note number 4. Okay, voice note number 4, 3rd of February 2024, 10:22. We are carrying on with the conversation, discussion, presentation on the ultimate disaster being war. And of course, this is part of our disaster relief cert awareness creating aspects that we are carrying out amongst communities and programs, not aspects, programs. Okay, moving on. I've just covered in voice note number 3 some of the very basics of international humanitarian law, and a very, very quick summary of the Geneva Conventions of 1949. 4 of them are actually, and of course, the additional protocols. But the one thing that I did want to in actual fact bring up is the Red Cross emblem. Now, bearing in mind that the International Red Cross movement is made up of 3 different entities. The very first one is the International Committee of the Red Cross. Their prime goal and function is to deal specifically and to work specifically in war-torn areas. And this means that they are also then responsible for dealing with and helping prisoners of war. The one thing that I also wanted to add is with regards to the ICRC, or the International Committee of the Red Cross, they are also responsible for the tracing agency which they run. And the tracing agency here is ultimately to reunite families and members of families who are separated in times of war. So that's the first function of the ICRC. Then there is the Federation. Today it's known as the Federation of Red Cross Societies. The Federation is a grouping of several national societies. For example, let's take Africa, for example. Africa, you've got national societies in each of the countries: South Africa, Chad, no, not me, the country, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, etc., etc. And of course, they have come together and they have formed a what's called the Federation, and they will share ideas and training and resources for the benefit of the region, i.e. Africa. And then, as I've just mentioned, you'll have national societies. National societies, their prime goal and function is to actually train members of the public in times of peacetime to be able to assist with disaster relief and, of course, the treatment of the sick and the wounded and shipwrecked in times of war. But this training must be done in peacetime. And in order to do this, the Red Cross movement as a whole has got very distinctive emblems which are used to signify the neutrality and the impartiality of the object that is in play or has on display the Red Cross emblem. Now, the Red Cross emblem initially started as a reversal of the Swiss flag, which was white cross on red background, reverse that, red cross on white background. Now, that Red Cross, as time has progressed and it has been introduced into various countries throughout, the last 100-odd years, some countries took exception to the use of the physical cross, and the introduction of the red crescent, which is a half moon in red on a white background, was introduced. And a bit after that, the red lion and rising sun was introduced because, again, certain religious groups took exception to both the cross and to the red crescent. However, in 2007, the red crystal, or it's a diamond-shaped emblem, all in red, just the outside borders are in red, the center of the diamond is white, and that's on a background of white. So those are the various types of emblems that we got. I will move on to voice note number 5 quickly in order to describe the various types of emblems. All right, so voice note number 5, 3rd of February 2024, it is 10:27. To continue now with the Red Cross emblems. As I've said, we've got the Red Cross, we've got the Red Crescent. The red line and rising moon has actually been phased out in most areas. And now we have the red crystal or diamond-shaped emblem. And all of these signify a neutral and impartial humanitarian organization. However, there's two types of emblems or two ways that the Red Cross emblems are utilized. The first one is called an indicative emblem. This emblem is an emblem that is small in size in relation to the object to which it is applied. In other words, it might be a small red cross on the front of your shirt or on your sleeves, or it might be something on the car door of an ambulance, for example. It doesn't take up a large space or very big. It might be on entrances to hospitals, that type of thing. So those are indicative. It is to show that those objects are basically designed and in use specifically for the use of neutral and impartial activities. The second emblem is what is called the protective emblem. And this is the emblem that ultimately is so large in size that it tries to occupy as much space as it can on the object to which it is applied. So you'll get a massive red cross on the back of a person, or they might be wearing a bib that literally the cross covers from chin all the way down to the hips and around the waistline in its entirety. Or it could be a massive cross on the side of the building or the roof of a building or on the side of an ambulance. Or in most cases, the International Committee of the Red Cross will in actual fact just fly massive big flags containing a red cross so that it can be seen literally 4 miles. And the purpose of the protective emblem is specifically that. It is to protect the object on which it is applied or worn. And as a result of that protective nature, what it means is that those objects should not be bombed or destroyed or attacked because they are under the protection of the Geneva Conventions, and that is subject to certain clauses. And this is where we need to be very careful when we start looking at the protective emblem, and why the abuse of the emblem must never be encouraged, never be permitted, never be allowed, and must be terminated the minute people find out they are abusing the emblem. So any red cross on a white background, whether it's got just the border of the cross in white, or whether it is a big circle or a big square, it doesn't make a difference. Any red cross on a white background should never be worn by anybody unless you are a member of the National Society or the International Red Cross movement, just to put it quite bluntly, if I can, on that aspect. Now, when we look at that protective emblem, I said there was a subject to clause. You cannot have a combatant from one state or party to the war who decides he needs to move from point A to point B, and in order to get to point B safely, he then puts on a red cross and he moves through the fields or whatever. That is not permitted. The minute that an active combatant wears a red cross or puts a red cross on a moving vehicle or a building and uses it for military purposes, that red cross protective emblem does not provide protection to that facility, and it is therefore no longer under the protection of the Geneva Conventions. Therefore, it is subject to being destroyed, the person subject to being killed, shot, whatever injured the case might be, or attacked in any essence or sense of the word. So the use of the Red Cross is something that must really be respected and only used by those that are members of the either the National Society, the Federation, or the International Committee of the Red Cross. In other words, you must be a member of the International Red Cross movement. The military Minister of Defense throughout the world, they permit their soldiers to wear red crosses for their military personnel, specifically to show that they are medical personnel and they are under the protection of the emblem itself. In the next one, I just quickly want to cover civil defense and the protection afforded in terms of the Geneva Conventions as well. So moving on to voice note number 6. In voice note number 6, 3rd of February 2024, 10:32, I want to briefly cover civil defense organizations in relation to the Geneva Conventions or international humanitarian law. It must be clearly noted that throughout the world, firstly, I just need to remind everybody that I'm continuing with the disaster relief cert topic on the ultimate disaster war. Okay, so it must be clearly understood that throughout the world, many countries have adopted what is now termed disaster management, and they are no longer called civil defense, or in South African perspective, where we did have a civil defense organization in the country. We had a Civil Defense Act, which was then renamed, rebranded, and repromulgated as the Civil Protection Act, because a lot of people in the country took exception to the word defense. But that was also in line with the fact that the United Nations, in terms of the UNDRR, or the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction body of the UN, introduced the entire concept of being proactive instead of reactive when it came to disasters. And as a result of that, the concept was no longer just responding to a disaster, but now to look at ways of preventing it. And therefore, the shift from the civil defense aspect moved into the civil protection in South Africa, which was identical to civil defense, but has now evolved into what we know as the Disaster Management Act and the disaster management process within various countries throughout the world, and that includes South Africa. However, now this is a very big however, and this is a subject which I am in the process of taking up with the disaster management structures within the country, both in my personal capacity, but also as a director of disaster relief cert, purely because of the fact that we need to ask the question as to what do the Geneva Conventions actually state regarding civil defense. And that is the critical and crucial aspect of this entire conversation. Because I just need to pause here for a moment. Right, apologies for pausing that. I wanted to just see how much content I would need and time I would need to have a look at the civil defense aspect, which means that I'm actually going to move over to voice note number 7 to specifically discuss civil defense matters. So let's move over to voice note number 7. Okay, with voice note number 7, 3rd of February 2024, time is 10:38. I'm continuing the disaster relief cert, the ultimate disaster war discussion. And in this particular voice note, I want to try and briefly describe the purpose of civil defense as outlined in the Geneva Conventions. And as I said in the previous voice note, that in South Africa, we don't have a civil defense, but we got a disaster management institution, which is responsible for various things throughout the country. However, it must be noted that the 1949 Geneva Conventions and the 1977 additional protocols define civil defense, not disaster management, as the performance of some or all of the undermentioned humanitarian tasks intended to protect the civilian population against the dangers. Take note, it is intended to protect the civilian population against the dangers and to help it recover from immediate effects of hostilities or disasters, and also to provide conditions necessary for its survival. Okay, so some of these tasks are warning, evacuation, management of shelters, management of blackout measures, rescue, medical services, firefighting, detection and marking of danger zones. It's an extensive list that is included. Hey, excuse me, now I get a sneeze in the middle of it. And a second one, my apologies, ladies and gents. Okay, so it's an extensive list that the Geneva Conventions has included in terms of civil defense. And take particular note of the phrase that was used, and to help it recover from the immediate effects of hostilities or disasters, and also to provide the conditions necessary for its survival. Therefore, when we start looking at international humanitarian law, when we look at the ultimate disaster called war, we have to consider the civil defense aspect. Now, here's an amazing thing. The civil defense definitions and articles, that's Article 62 to 65 of the additional protocol number 1, still stipulates that civil defense organizations and persons must not be the target of attacks or reprisals. Now, if you remember, I've spoken about the Red Cross emblem, and in terms of war in particular, war means that the military personnel will be wearing Red Cross emblems, and Red Cross personnel may be wearing Red Cross emblems. And I say may deliberately, because those medical personnel of Red Cross societies may be seconded to the National Defence Force, the South African National Defence Force in South African terms, and may be working in 1 mil or 2 mil or 3 mil or out on military ambulances, etc., etc. So I said may. However, it doesn't mean they will be. They could be operating under the direct auspices and direction of the South African Red Cross Society, yet still following and taking instruction from the Minister of Defence, and in particular the Surgeon General as appointed by the Defence Force. So in this aspect, when we look at civil defense organizations as a whole, there is a slight shift here where we are no longer looking at military being protected or the combatants being protected once they are no longer active or no longer participating as combatants, but more specifically the civilian population. So let's move on to voice note number 7. Okay, 3rd of February 2024, 10:42. Moving on, voice note number 8. I said 7 in the previous, it's actually number 8. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is voice note number 7. Number 8, my apologies, as we continue with the discussion on the ultimate disaster being war, and we are looking specifically at civil defense organizations in relation to and as outlined and defined by the Geneva Conventions, not by countries, not by the United Nations, but in terms of international humanitarian law directly from the Geneva Conventions, and more specifically the additional protocol number 1 to these conventions. Now, in terms of the conventions and AP1 in particular, we know for a fact that civil defense organizations and their persons must not be targeted or be a target of attacks or reprisals. However, Article 66 and Annexure 1 of Article 15 stipulates that civil defense organizations, their personnel and their material must be identified by a distinctive emblem. Well, that's an amazing thing, or a distinctive sign. Well, that's amazing. The Red Cross is a protected emblem or sign and may only be worn by the military as defined by the Minister of Defense or by members of the South African Red Cross Society or other members of the International Red Cross movement. So how do we, in actual fact, overcome the issue of civil defense organizations? Well, I'm pleased to announce that during the drafting of the additional protocols, it was decided that they would, in actual fact, have a very clear and distinct emblem, which is a blue triangle on an orange background. Simple, but wait a minute. Disaster management. Disaster management's got a blue triangle on a red background. Very similar, not the same, and it's definitely not the emblem that is specified in the Geneva Conventions. And therefore, civil defense organizations will, in actual fact, have to use the blue triangle on an orange background. That also means that every member of a civil defense organization must, in actual fact, have an ID card. They can wear a blue triangle and orange on an orange background on their sleeves as a patch, or the front of their shirt, or on their back. They can apply it to their vehicles, they can apply it to their equipment, they can apply it to their businesses, not businesses, their buildings and properties that are in use, etc. But every single person who is a member of a civil defense organization must have a properly issued identity card, which is identical to the card that is actually specified in the first protocol additional to the Geneva Conventions. The question then one would ask is, so how does one form a civil defense organization? No, you can't at all. The states that are party to a conflict, or who are proxies to a party to the conflict, may appoint civil defense organizations. So here's in less than a minute, I hope I can describe it. In terms of the Disaster Management Act, certain regulations were put in place due to COVID-19 in 2020. In times of war, the governing body, the government of the day, will issue a directive or regulation or introduce a law stipulating that a civil defense organization, or in the case of where there's been a disaster management structure, that might be renamed to a civil defense organization. No person, no party, I'm talking political party, no business can form a civil defense organization. It does not happen. The government must appoint one entity as the civil defense organization for that particular country. That means that all the other countries that are involved can appoint civil defense organizations, issue ID cards, and every single civil defense property, equipment, personnel also are protected in terms of the Geneva Conventions. Okay, moving on with voice note number 9 on the point of civil defense organizations. It must also be noted that there may only be one civil defense organization per country. And of course, I'm continuing the discussion on the ultimate disaster called war by Disaster Relief Cert. It is the 3rd of February 2024, and the time is 10:48. So that being said, there's only one civil defense organization per country, and every single person is afforded protection who is a member of the civil defense organization. Now, that is something that must be clearly understood, that Going back on the previous voice note, nobody else can form a civil defense organization or be considered a civil defense organization. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what this means is that in times of peace, by registering with and becoming involved with disaster relief organizations, such as the South African Red Cross, such as Disaster Relief CERT, or joining disaster management as a unit of volunteers, or getting involved in other official search and rescue organizations, such as SARSA or South African Rescue. What are they called now? SARSA. They used to be ARU, Off-Road Rescue Unit. Search and Rescue ZA, SARSA, SARZA, Search and Rescue South Africa ZA, Canine Search and Rescue, Wilderness Search and Rescue. These are official organizations. Another excellent organization to get involved in terms of disaster relief is, of course, Gift of the Givers. And through all of these entities, they will eventually at some point all come together under the disaster management, under the civil defense, or even under SA search and rescue in order to carry out various types of activities, etc., etc. But it is important to note that every single member of society should learn, should train, should get involved, that they can plug into either Red Cross or these other voluntary organizations, as I've just mentioned, or become involved in disaster management structures as a whole. It is something that every community member should, in actual fact, take a look at. Now, I think that gives us a pretty brief background into the various structures and entities that play a role in terms of war. And I think the big question now is, but, you know, having gone through all of that, what does this have to do with the ultimate disaster? Well, that's just it. How much more of a disaster could a country, a population, you as an individual, or you and your family could suffer? You know, an earthquake can come through the country. We know that that is a natural disaster. But then it's only going to affect certain areas of the country. It's not going to affect the entire country. A tornado can rip through certain parts of the province, but it doesn't affect the entire province. Then you got your economic disasters that it can affect the entire country. But is it in actual fact going to affect it at the same level that a full-blown outbreak of war will have the same impact? Will it have the same impact economically or natural disaster? Just stop and think of the impact of war. Look at what is happening in the Middle East at the moment. Today, 3rd of February 2024. And I'm not just talking about Israel, Gaza, West Bank. I'm not just talking about there. I'm talking about Syria. I'm talking about Myanmar. I'm talking about Yemen. How many other countries are having conflict at the moment? How many other countries are in actual fact, I need to move to the next one and discuss something else that is not just war, but is also war. It's not considered war, but it's got a context to war. It could be a war, but it's not a war in terms of the way that we know war to be. Let me move to the next voice note and explain that one. Okay, voice note number 10. This is actually an interesting one. War. The ultimate disaster. War. Most people will think of war as a war between two countries or two states. Well, that is the general term of a war, yes. That is, and then of course that can be blown out into a world war where multiple countries are at war with each other and are fighting and bombing each other and bringing about absolute and total devastation, which is what war does. But what happens when you start getting political groups or politicized groups within a country fighting against a government. There's a term for it. It's called civil war. We've seen this in the States going back many years. We've seen this still ongoing in Syria. It's a civil war. In terms of the Geneva Conventions, it is not a war between two different states, but it is a war between a group of citizens against the government. Well, fortunately, the Geneva Conventions have included civil war or civil disobedience in a country. And even in these instances of conflict, international humanitarian law applies. A lot is said, and there's a lot of question about, but you need to be party to the Geneva Conventions in order to have to abide by the Geneva Conventions. Actually, no. Your country, your government may already be subscribed to the Geneva Conventions. And if you as a movement within the country are carrying out a war or a conflict against your government, it still applies to you, fortunately, for the benefit of your forces, whether they are government or the movement itself. You see, even, I've got to be very careful in terms of my wording, because I still need to remain neutral and impartial. And I can't turn around and say, well, country A is doing this and country A is doing that, because I will lose credibility. And I can't afford that in order for me to work for my own safety, firstly, but secondly, to be able to reach out and assist those that need assistance, whether it be medical or even just the supply of food. Going back to the protection of the Red Cross emblem, that's been afforded by the protection of the Red Cross emblem, but also looking at the protection that is afforded by the civil defense emblem itself. Our actions as humanitarians also play a vital role. So when we start looking at war, we're not just talking about one country versus another country. We're talking about civil war and massive civil disobedience as well. Then finally, in terms of this concept of war, before we move on, and maybe I'll open up some questions at this point, but ultimately, I think what I need to do is say, look, whichever way we look at it, massive civil disobedience, or the riots that we saw of 2021 in KZN, or the conflict that we saw in South Africa pre-democracy of 1994, a lot of lives are lost. And international humanitarian law can still apply, and there can still be crimes against humanity. There could still be crimes in contravention of international humanitarian law outside of a war, even if it is only unrest, but especially those that are party to a civil war, the same principles apply. And I think that is something we should never, ever lose sight of. So at this point, I think I'm going to end this voice note number 10, and I'm going to move this over to a Q&A. I'll open the group up for the remainder, for the next 24 hours, and let's have a look and see if there are any questions. I would like to ask everybody to keep their questions specifically to the content that I've presented. Please, I have to ask this. All conspiracy theories, all other bits and pieces that people might have and thoughts, etc. Please, let's keep the conspiracy theories out. We're not going to be looking at how do we prepare, etc., etc. At this stage, all I'm looking for is questions and answers up until this point. Thank you very much, ladies and gents, and we'll pick up on the next set of voice notes in due course.